This morning we're going to be talking about the mission of the church. This is a third, or actually a fourth in a series of lessons we've been doing on the work of the church, the mission of the church. And we're going to be talking about benevolence this morning. Benevolence is something that, quite frankly, I don't preach enough about, don't really hear a whole lot about it, and we should. We should be thinking seriously about this because there's a lot of examples in Scripture about the early Christians that being a part of their work. And like I said, this is the third part, actually the fourth part in a series of lessons. We talked about 2 lessons on evangelism, collective evangelism as a church, and then personal evangelism. We talked about the work of the church being edification, building one another up. And this week we'll be talking about benevolence. And I'm kind of mixing the two together. The benevolence we do on the part of individuals, helping people as individuals, and also what we do collectively. I do think we could talk a whole lesson just on the distinction that the Scriptures make on those, and I may touch a little bit in passing, but that's not going to be my main focus here. We need to understand what benevolence is. First of all, I used to make fun of people when they would define a word before they go into it, but benevolence is one of those words we don't use a whole lot, and when we do, sometimes we misunderstand it. And so the idea is that it's this disposition to do good or to do goodwill. It's kindness. It's a charitableness. Charity means love. It's the love of mankind. It's accompanied with a desire to promote their happiness. It's a compassion. It's self-sacrificing, wanting to help other people out of their time of need when they're in a time of need. And so our outline this morning is going to be 3 main sections, 3 main points. And one is we're going to look briefly at the teaching of Christ, an example of his teaching on benevolence. We're going to look at some Bible patterns for benevolence. And also the very basis, the foundation for this work, some attitudes and some ideas that we need to take to heart that will help us keep in mind benevolence as we try to implement this in our own lives and as a congregation. And so with anything in the Scriptures, when we're studying about something, we can say, what do the Scriptures say about it? What did Jesus teach about helping others and those in need? And what kind of examples can we find there? Well, I'm going to look at one. It's in Luke chapter 10. I invite you to turn in your Bibles there. This is the story of the Good Samaritan, which many of us are familiar with, but I'm going to read it. Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25. We're going to read the whole story down through verse 37. And I'm going to point out some things along the way. Excuse me this morning, and my throat's a little scratchy. Starting in verse 25 of Luke chapter 10, the story comes on the heels of Jesus being questioned by a lawyer, a Jewish lawyer, somebody who's familiar with the law, and he was trying to, test Jesus, it says in verse 25. It says, "And a lawyer stood up and put him, Jesus, to the test, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' And he said to him, 'What is written in the law? How do you read it?' So he kind of turned it around on him and asked the lawyer what he thought. The lawyer said this in verse 27, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.' So you should love your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, Jesus said back to him, 'You've answered correctly. Do this, and you will live.' But wishing to justify himself, the lawyer responds back to Jesus saying this, 'Who's my neighbor?'" How can I get out of this? Do I have to be good to everybody, or exactly who is my neighbor? I mean, how many times do we have this tendency? Yeah, we know we need to do something, but what's the bare minimum I can do just to squeak into heaven, kind of just squeak by? So who is my neighbor exactly? Well, Jesus turns around and tells them the story of the Good Samaritan. We call it the story of the Good Samaritan. Starting in verse 30, Jesus replied and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho." We don't know a lot about who this man was, but if he was going from Jerusalem to Jericho, I don't know this for a fact, but it's not unlikely that this man was a Jew. He was starting in Jerusalem, going down to Jericho. I'm not dogmatic about that, but it's quite possible that this guy was a Jew. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers. And they stripped him and beat him, and they went away, leaving him dead. How humiliating. Can you imagine going down, we've heard sometimes in our society about people being robbed at a red light and somebody taking their car, like a carjacking. And if you ever had anything stolen from you, it's pretty humiliating. You feel violated. Can you imagine somebody taking all your clothes and leaving you there on the side of the road with nothing? That would be even more humiliating, wouldn't it? Can you imagine them leaving you naked, beat up, most likely bleeding on the side of the road? This guy was half dead, it says. In verse 31, and a priest, by chance a priest was going down on that road. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. They didn't want to get involved. But a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion. And he came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his beast, meaning he put the guy who was beat up on the side of the road, he put this guy on his own animal that he was traveling on. Most likely, he would have been walking beside. He gave up his own ride for this guy to be put along this beast and to be taken somewhere. And he brought him to an inn and took care of him. Notice in verse 35, on the next day. So this guy got involved, didn't he? He got his hands dirty. If a guy was bleeding on the side of the road with wounds, maybe we wouldn't want to get involved. We wouldn't want to get our hands dirty. This guy actually spent the time to get his hands dirty, put him in his own animal. You might think, well, I don't want that guy getting in my car with blood all over the place. I just got these new seats, and he's going to get the blood all over the place. How are we going to clean that up? This guy didn't care about that. He was willing to get his hands dirty, willing to take the time to do that. I'm sure he had a place to go. Have you ever, I remember, I never will forget this as long as I live. I was on my way to church one time in Atlanta, and I passed a guy on the side of the road broken down. And I thought, should I stop and help that guy? Oh, I'm going to be late for Bible class. I better keep going. I never will forget that. And I always feel bad about that. But anyway, because I didn't really want to get involved. I didn't know how long it would take me, and I had to be on my way. But anyway, this guy got involved. And notice, he brought him to an inn and took care of him. And on the next day, he left that inn. So he got involved all night with that guy, helping that guy. It wasn't just, hey, let me help you real quick and go on. It says on the next day, he took out 2 denarii. And I have a footnote, and I did some research. A denarii is about a day's wage. And I don't know how much you guys make in a day. Somebody said, if you take how many thousands of dollars you make a year, let's just use a number like 30,000, 40,000. Most of you make more than that. Some of you may not. But let's just say 40,000. If you divide that in half, that's 20, and that's about your hourly wage, like $20 for somebody who makes $40,000 a year. And you multiply that times 8, so 20 times 8, that's $160. Now 2 days' wage. How much is that? That's $320. This guy didn't even know him, shelling out $320 for this guy they didn't even know. Now, many of you make way more than that. And how much money would you actually care to get involved with a stranger and just shell out this kind of money for somebody to take care of them? But he gives the innkeeper that. He says, he gives him 2 days' wages. He came to the innkeeper and says, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you. Which of these 3, Jesus asked him, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into robbers' hands? And the lawyer answered him and said, the one who showed mercy toward him. And Jesus said to him, go and do the same. So let's look at a couple of these things. The second thing is that the people who should have been first to help him, and if this guy was a Jew, leaving from Jerusalem, go down to Jericho, if he was a Jew, if you're religious, who are you going to go to? You're going to go to your priest, right? I mean, if you get in trouble, the priest who should have helped him, he wasn't helping him. The Levite, you'd think the Levite, that's where the priests come from. Do you think that guy would have helped him? He didn't help him either. Wow, that's sad, isn't it? The Samaritan, when he comes along, makes these people look bad. Have you ever been made look bad by somebody who's not a Christian? They just kind of really make you think, wow, that guy makes me look bad. I'm the Christian. I should know better, and yet this guy's making me look bad. It's kind of like if you're a professional race car driver and you get beat by, I don't know, somebody who is like a grandmother, who's never raced before on a track. I did a triathlon one time in my 20s, and I was the very last person out of the water. And all these like 70-year-old women were like out of the water before me. And that was embarrassing. Well, this guy, these priests and these Levites were embarrassed. They got shamed by this Samaritan. They didn't even like the Samaritans. They didn't want help from a Samaritan. They wouldn't even stop to help a Samaritan. But the Samaritan, you see in this story, he stops and he helps them. Wow, what a lesson that is. Look at James chapter 4 and verse 17. Keep your finger there, or keep a mark there. We're going to go over to James chapter 4 and verse 17. It's right after Hebrews. James 4:17 says this, therefore, To one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. Now that's the principle that these priests got caught up in. They knew that they needed to be helping that guy, and they didn't do it. They were sinning. But you see, they would think, well, who is really my neighbor? I really don't know that guy. That guy doesn't live next to me. I've never seen him before. But they knew that they needed to be stopping. The Samaritan, though he was hated by the Jews, he had mercy and helped. He loved his neighbor. Turn with me briefly, keep your hand here in Luke chapter 10. We're going to go over to Galatians 6 and verse 10. There's a principle here in the New Testament that's, he's talking to Christians here, but it still applies. He says, so then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. We normally focus on just the household of faith. We're often like that lawyer saying, well, who is really my neighbor? If I help out my brethren, then doesn't that count? But you see, the first part of that verse is, do good to all men, especially those who are of the household of faith. That's what the Samaritan was doing. Wasn't the Samaritan doing that? He didn't know this guy. He knew that he was helping a guy that didn't even like him, most likely, if he was a Jew. But that didn't matter to him. And the point of this, Jesus says, go and do the same. He tells that lawyer, you go and you do the same as this Samaritan did. The Samaritan wasn't just keeping up with his countrymen. He wasn't just helping out his countrymen. He was willing to help other people who didn't like him back. And isn't that what the nature of the gospel is? Isn't that what the nature of being a Christian is? Isn't that what Jesus did? Help people who didn't even like him back? Well, how can we be more neighborly? We need to be more neighborly. The Samaritan was neighborly, wasn't he? Well, like any question, we need to try to find some examples in scriptures. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at some different patterns for benevolence, showing compassion on others. First of all, it's commanded. Look at Romans chapter 12. We're done with Luke, so you don't have to put a bookmark there anymore. In Romans chapter 12, Paul's writing to the church at Rome, and starting in verse 9 through 13, he encourages them, he says, let love be without hypocrisy. In other words, don't just say that you love somebody and then not show it by your actions. A lot of people say they love you, Oh, I love this person, I love this. I love chocolate cake. Love is kind of cheapened in many forms. But he says, let love be without hypocrisy. We know what a hypocrite is, don't we? It's somebody who says one thing and does another. And he says, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor, not lagging behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, persevering in tribulation, devoted to prayer. And in verse 13 is kind of what I want to bring our attention to. He says, contributing to the needs of the saints, and also, he says, practicing hospitality. A couple weeks ago, we said hospitality literally means love of strangers. But he says, giving the needs of the saints, also practicing hospitality. Galatians, we're talking about Galatians 6:10, you don't have to turn there, but he was saying, do good to all men, especially those of the household of faith. And so there's two different camps there we should be looking for. I admit in my life that I'm much more likely to help out brethren. That's just kind of my tendency, is because I have a relationship with brethren, I love the brethren, and it's easier for me to help out brethren than a total stranger. But I need to be more like Christ in helping out other people as well. I need to be like the more good Samaritan, where I'm letting the light of Christ show in the world to other people. If you look back in Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, this is kind of the foundational principle that allows this to happen in our own lives, is this transformation that we have, this living a sacrifice that we present ourselves to God. He says, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. What does a sacrifice do? A sacrifice gives up its own life so that other people can benefit, right? Isn't that what the Samaritan was doing? The Samaritan was giving up his own trip, his own plans, his own day to serve others. And that's, if we have that kind of attitude where we give up our own life as a sacrifice to God, then we're going to be pursuing the things of God. We're going to be open to the opportunities that God has for us on a daily basis to serve Him. And in verse 2 says, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is. So there is a tendency for us to be like the world. Well, when we're busy being like the world, we're not being like the Samaritan, you see. We're not fulfilling that example when we're all caught up in being like the world. And so he says, be transformed. But renew your mind. The literal translation of this word is make new again. Make your mind new again in a spiritual sense so that you can help. And for what purpose? To prove, and I think this means prove to others, what the will of God is, which is good and acceptable and perfect. The Samaritan, even though he wasn't a Jew, he was proving what the will of God was. And for us, without even saying a word, if we have this attitude in helping others, we're showing the light of God's grace in the world without even saying a thing. And so that is a very important thing for us to understand. In Romans chapter 15, verse 25, the churches here were very happy to help out others, and they had that attitude. Romans 15, starting in verse 25, he says, but now I am going to Jerusalem to serve the saints, or to minister to the saints. So he's on his way to deliver the collection that we've talked about this morning when Rich was up here. He says, for Macedonia and Achaia, and remember the church in Thessalonica, that was in Macedonia. The church in Corinth, that was in Achaia. They've been pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. Yes, they were pleased to do so, and they are indebted to them. For if the Gentiles have shared in their spiritual things, they are indebted to minister to them in material things. And so they enjoyed this kind of relationship where they wanted to help other brethren. They wanted to help other Christians. Notice here they were taking up the collection for specifically Christians. They weren't necessarily taking up a collection for everybody in the community. Let's turn to Acts chapter 2. To further our line of thinking here, let's look at what the early church did. The church started on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, and I'm just really shocked by the generosity that they showed each other. I mean, when you see this kind of generosity, that's almost like puts the Samaritans to shame. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 44, I love this. Right after the 3,000 people got baptized after the first gospel sermon, it said in Acts chapter 2, 44, and all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. You say, Joe, that sounds like communism. That sounds like socialism, doesn't it? They were sharing everything. And they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all as anyone might have need. Notice that if somebody had a need, they were willing to give up what they had in order to share it with somebody else. What an example for us. And also, if we would turn over to chapter 4, in verse 32. It says, and the congregation of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and not one of them claimed that anything belonging to him was his own, but all things were common property to them. Like, that surely sounds like communism, doesn't it? The difference is communism is forced on you. You see, these people were doing it willingly, out of the generosity of their heart. You can't force that on people, You can't force that on people. That has to come from within their heart. And I just get amazed at that example. In verse 33. And with great power the apostles were giving testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and abundant grace upon them all. For there was not a needy person among them. For all who were owners of land or houses would sell them, and bring the proceeds of the sales, and lay them at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed to each as any had a need. Wow, that is amazing. Do we really think about that? I mean, is that to us just a nice story? I think many times, it's just a nice story. But that is the example that these Christians were laying down. That if anybody had a need, they were willing to not just give of their surplus, they were willing to sacrifice right along with them to make sure that other people's needs were met. And an example of this is starting in verse 36 of the same chapter with Barnabas. We know Barnabas, the son of encouragement. We've been studying about him on Wednesday nights. He was Paul's traveling companion. It said, now Joseph, a Levite Cyprian, of Cyprian birth, And Nathan told us last week that remember, Barnabas was from Cyprus, that island of Cyprus. That's a Cyprian, who was called Barnabas by the apostles, which is translated the son of encouragement. He owned a tract of land, verse 37. He sold it, brought the money, and laid it at the apostles' feet. He was an example of an individual who was doing this and was dedicating this as well. So mixed in here, you have examples of individuals and collective units all having this same attitude of heart where they want to give to those in need. Especially their brethren. They want to make sure that all the brethren are taken care of, that there's equality among the brethren. In Acts chapter 9 and verse 36, we see this example of Tabitha. She was the one who Peter raised from the dead. It says, now in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which is translated in the Greek called Dorcas. This woman was abounding with deeds of kindness and charity, which she continually did. Here's an example of a woman who was abounding in these things, and when she died, all the people were grieved, and then they were that much more rejoicing when she was raised back from the dead. In Acts chapter 11, and I'm not hitting all the examples. I mean, there's many examples of the New Testament. I just kind of want to hopefully inspire us and motivate us to be like some of these people. In Acts chapter 11 and verse 27, this is the church at Antioch. It says, now at this time, somebody came to Antioch, a prophet came. Now at this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine over the whole world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius. And in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea. And this they did, sending it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders. But notice this, in each one of them, in the proportion that they had the means to do so, they each determined to send this contribution. Now, when we hear about somebody in need, or we know of a need, do we have that same kind of attitude? Many of us think, well, somebody else will take care of it, Or, I've heard this before, and this is not picking on anybody, but, I'll match what you do. I'll do this, you do that. But in the proportion that each person had means, they were giving different amounts, no doubt, but they were all taking care of that need. What a great example for us. Turn with me to 1 Corinthians real quick. 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Starting in verse 15. In the beginning of the chapter, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, that's the example we have for the collection that we take up on Sundays. But here in chapter 15, Paul exhorts this church in Corinth in his closing. He says, now I urge you, brethren, you know the household of Stephanas, that they were the first fruits of Achaia, meaning, I understand that to be the first converts there in that region, where Corinth is. And that they devoted themselves for the ministry or for serving the saints. This guy was devoted. Him and his household, they were devoted to that. And he says that you be in subjection to such men and to everyone who helps in the work and labors. He says, I rejoice over the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Archias, because they have supplied what was lacking on your part. For they have refreshed my spirit and yours, therefore acknowledge such men. I see, perhaps this church at Corinth, they may have been supplying something to him, or they may not have been doing their duty, but he's saying this guy is devoted servant. He's actually, as an individual, making up for what you guys should be doing collectively as a group. But that guy was dedicated. And I often say, you don't have to wait for your congregation to support a man or to help somebody in need for you to do it. If there's somebody preaching the gospel that's in need, you don't have to wait for the congregation as a whole to decide that man needs help. You can give to that man directly if you think he needs help. And conversely, if somebody's in a physical need, you don't have to wait for the whole congregation to get around and do it. You can give that to them individually. That's what the kind of guy that Stephanas was. He was a guy that he was devoted to serving the saints, and he was making up for the lack of what the other Christians should have been doing. And so we need more people like Stephanas. Well, let's look back at the beginning of the chapter, because when we think about collectively as a church, what kind of benevolence or helping out the poor, the needy we need to be doing, we want to make sure that we have a pattern that's given in Scripture. It's very important for us when we practice anything in religion to go back to the Bible and always use the Bible pattern, because over hundreds and thousands of years, different man-made traditions and our own best thinking creeps in, and next thing you know, the church doesn't really look like the church in the Bible so much anymore. So usually, my attitude and the attitude of many of the people here is, if we're going to do something, let's do it like they did it in the Bible. And when it comes to benevolence and taking up a collection, we have an example here at the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And we use this as the church's pattern for raising funds. If the church is going to raise money, there's a lot of ways we could do it. We could sell raffle tickets, we could have a carnival, we could have a bake sale, we could do a lot of different things. But we're trying to be careful not to do anything that's not in the Scriptures, because we don't want to be known as your local bakery. We don't want to be known as your local arcade or whatever. So what we want to be known as is the group in the community that teaches the Bible and spreads the gospel and helps people live holy lives and get closer to God. And so one of the things that we're careful to do is raise funds in the pattern that was given in the Scriptures. And if you look at the first couple verses here, Paul says to the church in Corinth, he says, "Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the other churches, or the churches in Galatia, so do you also." So, in other words, I'm telling you the same thing that I told the churches in Galatia. "On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save, as he may prosper, so that no collection be made when I come." And I want to look a little bit deeper in here. He says that this is, as I directed other churches, I'm telling you. Some versions, New King James Version says that I commanded them to do this, or I ordered them to do this, and now I'm telling you. And what we can take away from that is a directive. That is a command for us, and it's not just an example, but he was ordering these people to do this in such a way so that they would not have to scurry around and take a haphazard collection when they came. When they were all together, they were going to set aside money for this purpose. I think that this is limited in use because he says it's the collection for the saints. If you notice, if you look at verse 1, he says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints." I'm not talking about saints in the way that like maybe Catholic or Orthodox churches use that, where it's somebody who's elevated above a normal Christian. The literal translation of this word into English is holy ones. He's talking about Christians. Now concerning the collection for these needy Christians. And we kind of confirm that later on when we just read in Romans and we look in 2 Corinthians. What they did with this collection was they sent it to the needy Christians in Judea at the time, in Jerusalem. So this was limited in their use. And I think that's an important part here. An important point is because we need to make sure that the way that we use the funds, as Rich was talking about this morning, is in a way that is authorized to use it. Some people want to use it to just, I guess, feed the hungry in the community. And that is a good work. But there is always going to be more socioeconomic needs in the world than the church has resources to meet. And so our main priority, and the point of this series is, our main priority and our main mission of the church is for evangelism, for edification, and benevolence, meaning we spread the gospel, we build up the Christians in order to do the work of service, and we help our own. We help the needy saints. As individuals, we give to others in the community. So don't think I'm hard-hearted. I don't want to be mistaken in any way. I'm just saying it's many churches have gone down the road over the last several thousand years into becoming what is called the movement is called a social gospel. But when I think of social, I think of like a party. It's not really that. There's many social needs in our community. There's hungry people. There's homeless people. There's social type needs and one way that a lot of the temptation for a church to get popular and among the community would be to go out into the community, see what all those social needs are, and then to try to meet those social needs. But what often happens is they lose their core focus. They lose the core mission, where they're not really evangelizing, they're not really building up qualified people to teach the Bible and that know the Scriptures. and they're not really taking care of their own because those resources have been reallocated. So anyway, that's a long-winded explanation, but I think this collection is limited for the saints. That doesn't preclude me, like I'm saying, from helping out people in the community, and as a matter of fact, I should be, the Good Samaritan everywhere I go. Notice also that it's done regularly. He says upon the first day of the week. Well, that's a Sunday in our calendar, isn't it? And so every Sunday when we come, this is what we do. He says, each one of you are to do this. Each one of you. And this involves individual responsibility as I have been prospered. So you obviously can't be held responsible if you haven't been prospered at all, but many of us have been prospered, and so proportionate to the way that we've been prospered, it's our individual responsibility to contribute for the work of the church. Again, evangelism, benevolence, and building up of the saints. And also, it's this lay by and store, this common collection, so that Paul, when he came, would not have to take up a collection for these needs that they were going to be doing, which was delivering some contribution to needy Christians in Jerusalem. If you have any questions about that, or if that's a little different than what you've heard before, you see any problems with that, according to Scripture, if you have anything, come up to me later afterwards and we can discuss. And that's true for anything that we do here. If you're a visitor and you find anything we do that's not in line with Scripture, we want to know about it, because we want to just be doing things as the Scripture says. But I believe that there are some Bible patterns for benevolence, and we constantly need to be asking ourselves if we're following those patterns or not. And it's up to the members here, if you see something that we're doing that's not in accordance to that pattern, to bring it to the attention of the congregation so that we can fall back in line. And I hope that we would not, I hope that just because we might have been doing something for 20 years, if it was brought to our attention that we were doing something wrong, that we would have the attitude to change. And thirdly, I think there's an important need, because we can know, there's an important need to kind of have some underlying motivators here, the basis for this work, because we can know the teachings of Christ, we can see the patterns in the Bible, but without developing the basis in our own lives, we're probably not going to actually be motivated to action. So let's look at this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 25, just turn back a couple pages. And I'm starting in the middle of the verse, excuse me for doing that. He says, so that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may be the same, care for one another. And remember, in this idea, he's talking about how individual Christians are members of this body, the spiritual body, and different members have different functions, and how some seem weaker than others and they don't seem as important, but they have the greater honor. He says in verse 26, this is where I'm going towards, he says, if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. So that's one of the fundamental bases for this work of benevolence and taking care of our own, is that when you suffer, I need to be suffering. You know, when Andy's suffering, we all suffer. When Rich suffers, we all suffer. That kind of idea. Do we have that as much as we should? Or do we think, well, they'll figure it out. You know, they deserve it. They got themselves in that mess. We don't need to be like that. We need to have compassion for other people. The Samaritan could say, well, that guy could have been traveling with those robbers, and he deserved to get beat up. You know, I'm not going to get involved with him. We need to have compassion for one another. One suffers, all the rest suffer with them. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Turn there. This is when Paul's writing some instructions to young Timothy. He's given some instruction, especially about our desire to and our tendency to hold on to the things that we have, or hold on to the money that we make. In verse 17, he says, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or puffed up, or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. And that's the tendency, is to, if my mind is focused on making wealth, which is easy to do because we live in that kind of society when we're constantly marketed to. But if my mind is fixed over there, any money I get, that's been my goal, and now I have it, and I want to hold on to that as much as possible. So while I might want to help other people, you can have a little bit. But this is where my mind is, you see. And he's telling them, he said, don't fix your hope on riches, because you need to fix your hope on God. Verse 18, he says, instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works. So not be rich in your bank account, but to be rich in the things that you do. Be rich in good deeds, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed, meaning eternal life. And so that's one of our motivations that we need to be conscious of, is to keep our hearts fixed on God, and not to have our hearts fixed on our money that prevents us from being as benevolent and loving others and being willing to suffer with other people as we otherwise could. And look at 1 John 3 and verse 16. Here's another motivation. It's the gratitude that comes from knowing what Christ did for us. In 1 John 3:16 says, "We know love by this." This is how we know that God loved us. That He laid down His life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. That ties back into point 1. If they suffer, we suffer. We're willing to lay down our life for others because of an appreciation for what was done for us. There was a movie several years ago called Pay It Forward. Some of you may have seen that movie. It was the idea that somebody gave up something to somebody else, and it just went on and on and on. In the appreciation, as we continue to grow and mature as Christians, and we come to know more and more about the love of God, that should create a change in us. And that change that it should create in us is the ability to turn around to the next person and shine God's love into their life. Keeping our hopes fixed on God, being willing to suffer with others. Turn with me back to James chapter 2 real quick in verse 15. Actually, I'm going to start in verse 14. He says, "What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith and he has no works? Can faith save him?" And we live in a country today where a lot of people say, "Yeah, I believe in God. Yeah, I'm a Christian." If you just ask the common person if they believe in God, they're a Christian. Oh, yeah. It used to be more common, but it's getting less and less. But a lot of people say that. In verse 15, he says, "If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' and yet does not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that?" In other words, if we hear somebody has a need and we basically turn our backs and say, "Good luck with that, hope it works out," and we don't actually help them out and give them what they need, saying your faith is useless, man. Verse 17, he says, "Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself." You can find everybody who says, "Yeah, I'm a Christian. Yeah, I have faith." But, well, you're going to back it up? You're going to live like that and help other people out when they're in need? That's the point. Furthermore, we're going to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and we're going to kind of go through this chapter and the following chapter, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. So the rest of this lesson we'll be spending primarily in this with our remainder of time. And I didn't even plan it. Richard used a lot of verses. He read the whole chapter 9, so you saved me some time there. 2 Corinthians 8, verses 3 through 5, if you would look at that, I'm going to read. He says, "For I testify, according to their ability, and beyond their ability they gave of their own accord." And I should kind of give you some background here. This is the second letter that we have that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. He's trying to encourage them to make good on their promise to take up this collection for the needy saints in Jerusalem. And in order to encourage them, as we often do sometimes, is we use an example of somebody else who's done the same. It's kind of like what that example before is like, I'll help them if you'll help them. Well, in this situation, the churches in Macedonia had helped. And they helped when they really didn't have a lot of money to be helping. But notice in verse 3, I'll read it again. He says, "For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord." Meaning, we didn't force them to do it. They didn't give just like out of their excess. They gave beyond really what they should have been giving, beyond their ability. In verse 4, he says, begging us, really, with much urging for the favor of participating for the support of the saints. Please take our money to help these people. Oh, man, you need to save that money for you. You know, you're having trouble paying your light bill and this, that. No, take it. I want to help these people. That's the kind of attitude they had. He says, and this not as we had expected, and this is what I want to point out in verse 5, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. And this is one of the bases, one of the foundational bases Is that a word? Basi? It's a foundation for this benevolence that we're trying to accomplish. It's dedicating ourselves to the Lord's work. And the point of this is, these people, they didn't have much money, but they were dedicated to God. And because they were dedicated to God, because they didn't really consider their own needs, they considered the needs of other people. They knew God's love for them, and that was shining forth into the life of other people, like we've been talking about. If one suffers, all suffer. Because that situation was occurring here, they were wanting to give to somebody else, even at their own hurt. And that is because of they dedicated themselves to God, and as a result, to God's purposes. If you look down in verse 8 for a second here, he says, I'm not speaking this as a commandment to you, Corinthians. I'm not telling you guys had to do this. The Macedonians, we didn't command them to do it. They begged us to take the money. And he said to the Corinthians here, I'm not speaking this as a commandment in verse 8, but as proving through the earnestness of others the sincerity of your love also. We were talking about this a couple weeks ago with somebody, I think. And what he's saying is, this is a sincere love that's going to be proven to other people by your liberality. This is the true word of being this is a good liberal, right? Somebody who's liberally giving. They're liberally giving, they're generously giving. And he's saying, the point is, by you doing this proves that you really have love. And it also, this idea picks up in verse 24. He says, therefore, openly before the churches, show them the proof of your love and of our reason for boasting about you. When you guys give like the Macedonians gave, when you suffer right along with them, and we take this to those needy saints in Jerusalem, they're going to be impressed. We've been boasting about you, but when they see this, it's going to prove to them that you really do love them. And so that's another basis, is that once we do dedicate ourselves, the love that we show others, our brethren, and also for even strangers, it shows our true love of God manifesting outwardly in other people's lives. 2 Corinthians 8, if we can go back to verse 9, he says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. Again, we visited this idea before, you see. It's in 1 John, what God has done for us produces a gratitude and a reaction in others. He's saying the same thing here about Christ. Christ was rich, he became poor, so that you could be rich. You could be spiritually rich with God and have those blessings. And in chapter 8 and verse 12 is another important concept too, because the reaction naturally is when we want to help people, you're like, okay, Joe, I'm on board, I want to help others, but man, I'm kind of strapped right now. I got more bills coming in than I have income really, and I'm kind of upside down. I really can't help people like I'd want. Well, this principle makes us, for the people in that situation, this tells you that God honors what you have. In verse 12, he says, for if the readiness is present, meaning your attitude is right, if the readiness is present, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. I'm reminded of the story of the widow who just had those 2 mites, and there was another guy who had a bunch of money, and he threw all his coins in there in the treasury and probably made a big glang, and everybody's like, whoa, that guy gave a lot of money. And this woman just put in 2 mites. And Jesus was more impressed with her because she gave all that she had to live on. And so if we have that right attitude about helping others, God honors that according to what we have, not according to what we don't have. We don't need to be comparing ourselves with others and seeing what they're doing and what they're giving. We can always help in some way. And it doesn't have to be necessarily physical money. It could be a meal. It could be other things we do to help somebody in need. It could be wrapping somebody's wounds like the Samaritan did. Also, we need to look in verse 14 real quick. The idea that one of the foundational bases for this work is so that there be equality. He says, at the present time, your abundance being a supply for their need, so that their abundance may also become a supply for your need, that there may be equality. And there's this idea, we kind of joked earlier in Acts 2 and verse 4 that this sounded like communism. But it's really this notion that I don't want to have anything better than, I don't want to be because I love my brethren so much, I don't want to be in a situation where they are without and I have something. Remember, it kind of almost reminds me of the heart of David, where he's thinking, I'm living in this cedar house and God doesn't have a house. It's this idea that if my brethren or not having anything, but yet I have a bunch of stuff. Well, there's a problem. I should feel bad about that, and I want this equality to be there, and I want to share. Let's look over at chapter 9. Again, Rich read the whole chapter. We're just going to look at 6 through 11 here real quick, and then 12 through 15. In 6, he says, "Now this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must do as he's purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion. For God loves a cheerful giver." This all ties in because the Macedonians, they weren't forced to give. They begged for the opportunity to contribute to the need, you see, because their heart had been transformed. Paul's telling the Corinthians earlier, he says, I'm not telling you to do this out of a command. I'm not telling you have to do this. But if your love is like what you say it is, you're going to be proving your love through this act of generosity. And that's what, if we purpose in our heart to sow bountifully for God's purposes, we're going to reap the spiritual benefits of that as well. And he's saying, don't be grudgingly doing it. If you purpose to do this cheerfully, because that's what God appreciates. He loves a cheerful giver. So we need to be willingful, we need to be purposeful, and we need to have this confidence of heart. You're not going to accidentally, everything that we want to achieve in life, we set goals for, right? You're not going to accidentally achieve anything usually in life that you have to work hard towards. We set those goals. And so one of our goals needs to be helping out people. And so if that is my goal, and I need to be purposeful about it. And in order to be purposeful about that, maybe that's going to take some planning on my part well before a need arises. And what I mean by that is, I don't necessarily, if I have a steady income, and some of us don't have steady incomes, but if I have a steady income, I've already purposed and planned how much I'm going to dedicate to the Lord's work. I've thought about that ahead of time before I even come here on Sundays. If I want to help those people in my community that are in need, I want to plan to have something to share with them. You see, that's the whole idea of the collection on the first day of the week, is that Paul didn't want to have to take a collection when he came. He wanted it to already be set aside. And so if you want to start being purposeful about helping people in your community with your time or your money or your resources, you need to start carving out some opportunity there, either some times that you can help serve people, some resources that you can help serve people, and so that when somebody has a need, you'll be able to do that. And that means getting our finances in order many times. We live in a country where that's not really praised too much, but if we're going to be focused on helping others, we need to be getting our own house in order as well. And finally, glorifying God. If you look at chapters 9, starting in verse 12 and following, he says, "For the ministry of this service, it's not only fully supplying the needs of the saints, so it's not just taking care of their material needs, but it's also overflowing through many thanksgivings to God." Meaning, there are people thanking God for this gift. God's getting glory as a result of what you're doing. It's putting food in their mouth, but God's getting glory as a result of it. Verse 13, "Because of the proof given by the ministry, they will glorify God for your obedience to your confession of the gospel and for the liberality of your contributions to them and to all, while they also, by prayer on your behalf, yearn for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift." As a result, and finally, see, God is being glorified. God gets the glory. If I give somebody else something and I get the glory for it, there's a problem there. If my motivation to help out people is so that I get an attaboy on the back, or, hey, Joe, we're going to put your name on this building because you helped out somebody so much, then I get the glory. But the point is that God needs to be getting the glory. And that's the true test if God's pleased with it. He needs to be getting the glory and the honor because all the resources we have come from him anyway. In other words, we need to center our hearts on God, center our hearts on Christ in order to effectively serve the poor. And the final question in closing here is, how well is our love, individually and as a congregation, how well is our love being expressed to those in need? I want you to ask yourselves this. In my life, how well is my love for God being expressed to those in need? Do the people around me, the needy people in my community, are they seeing the love of God being manifested in my life? Or do I have an attitude of who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? All right, well, let's ask that. Let's ask that question. Let's just say that your neighbor is your brethren for a moment. And I don't think that it's just exclusively that. How well is your brethren feeling the love of God from you? How much generosity are they feeling, especially those in need? Well, we need to think about that. And it doesn't necessarily, there are people who make a good living, and you think, well, they don't need anything. They make a lot of money. They may have some needs. We need to be attuned to those needs. Somebody may be sick and they have a need. Their car could break down. They have a need. There's all kinds of needs that we have, and we need to be mindful of those. It's our custom, in closing, to offer an invitation for those who have not accepted the gospel of Christ, people who may have become Christians and have stopped seeking the Lord and started seeking their own way, have become easily conformed to the way of this world and the deceitfulness of riches and the enticements of sin, and you find yourself in this quagmire, and you're like a dog, like the scripture says, a dog going back to its vomit, and you find yourself waking up and think, how did I get this far away from the Lord? We want to help you get back into a right relationship with the Lord. If you need the prayers of the congregation, or if you need to recommit your life to Christ or commit your life to Christ for the first time, we want to invite you to do that as we stand and as we sing.